A tiny girl born from a flower, kidnapped by a toad, sold to a beetle, and finally rescued by a fairy prince. You think you know the story of Thumbelina? A charming tale about finding where you belong and discovering true love? But what if I told you this beloved fairy tale wasn't about magic at all? What if I told you that Hans Christian Andersen, Thumbelina, was actually a detailed manual documenting the Victorian era's most horrific crime, the systematic trafficking and sexual exploitation of children? Because when you strip away the fantasy elements and examine what actually happens in this story, you're not reading about a magical journey. You're reading a step-by-step documentation of how a child trafficking network operated in 19th century Europe. Every kidnapping, every sale, every forced marriage in Thumbelina follows the exact patterns used by real criminal organizations that bought, sold, and exploited thousands of children across Victorian Europe. Welcome back, truth seekers. Before we expose this horrifying truth, let's revisit the story you think you know. Once upon a time, a woman longed for a child. A fairy gave her a special barley corn, and when she planted it, a beautiful flower bloomed. Inside the flower was a tiny, perfect girl, no bigger than a thumb, whom she named Thumbelina. But Thumbelina's innocence didn't last long. One night, an ugly old toad saw the sleeping child and decided she would make a perfect wife for her son. The toad kidnapped Thumbelina and carried her away to a swamp, placing her on a lily pad while she went to prepare the wedding. Some fish, taking pity on the crying child, helped her escape by gnawing through the lily pad's stem, and she floated away down the river. But her freedom was short-lived. A large beetle spotted the beautiful little girl and snatched her up, carrying her to his tree where he lived with other beetles. At first, the beetle was enchanted by Thumbelina's beauty, but when the other beetles criticized her appearance, saying she was too different, too strange, he decided she was worthless and abandoned her in the forest. Alone and helpless, Thumbelina survived a harsh winter by taking shelter with an old field mouse who demanded household labor in exchange for food and warmth. But even this refuge became dangerous when the mouse's neighbor, a wealthy mole, decided he wanted to marry Thumbelina. The mole lived in elaborate underground tunnels, was completely blind, and hated sunlight and flowers, everything that Thumbelina loved. Despite her protests, the mouse insisted the marriage would be beneficial, as the mole could provide security and wealth. Just before the forced wedding, Thumbelina was rescued by a tiny flower fairy prince who had been saved by her kindness earlier. He gave her wings, made her a fairy princess, and they flew away together to live happily ever after in the land of flowers. It sounds like a typical fairy tale. Magical creatures, impossible adventures, and a happy ending. But this sanitized version obscures something much darker.
Yes.
Hans Christian Andersen wasn't writing fantasy. He was documenting, in coded language, the horrific reality of child trafficking that was epidemic across 19th century Europe, with Copenhagen serving as one of its most notorious hubs. To understand what Thumbelina really represents, you need to understand the man who wrote it and the world he lived in. We've already established that Hans Christian Andersen was psychologically disturbed, obsessed with social hierarchy and genetic superiority. But there's another side to Andersen that's even more troubling. His personal diaries, preserved in Danish archives, contain numerous references to visits to what he cryptically calls special houses and houses of entertainment in Copenhagen's red light district in Victorian Europe. These were euphemisms for brothels. But not just any brothels. Copenhagen in the 1830s and 1840s was notorious for what were called houses of dolls, establishments that specialized in the sexual exploitation of very young girls, some as young as 7 or 8 years old. Police records from the period document organized networks that kidnapped or purchased children from rural areas and transported them to cities where they were forced into prostitution. These weren't random crimes. They were sophisticated commercial operations with established routes, standardized procedures, and tiered systems of exploitation. And when you examine Thumbelina with this historical context in mind, every element of the story maps perfectly onto the documented methods used by these criminal networks. Let's start with Thumbelina herself. Her defining characteristic isn't just that she is small, it is that she is described as being thumb-sized. This wasn't random descriptive language, Victorian England and Denmark. Thumb-sized was a coded euphemism used in certain circles to refer to girls who were extremely young and physically underdeveloped. The emphasis on her tiny size, her childlike innocence, and her vulnerability would have been immediately recognizable to contemporary readers familiar with the child trafficking trade. The story begins with Thumbelina being born from a flower, specifically from a barleycorn given by a fairy. In Victorian symbolism, flowers represented female virginity and purity. The specific mention of barley is significant because barley was associated with fertility, rituals, and was considered sacred to goddesses of youth and innocence. Thumbelina doesn't just appear. She's cultivated like a crop, grown specifically to be harvested. Now let's examine each of Thumbelina's captors. Because when you understand what they represent, the trafficking pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The first kidnapper is Mrs. Toad, who steals Thumbelina to marry her son. In Victorian slang, toad was a derogatory term for members of the criminal underclass. Toads live in swamps and sewers, the literal underworld. Mrs. Toad represents the lowest tier of trafficking networks, the street-level criminals, who did the actual kidnapping and initial transportation of victims. The forced marriage to her son isn't about romance. It's about establishing ownership. Historical records show that trafficking networks often used sham marriages or claims of betrothal to justify their control over children and to provide legal cover for their exploitation. The Toadess plan to keep Thumbelina on a lily pad while preparing the wedding reflects the real practice of holding victims in temporary locations while arrangements were made for their sale or use. When Thumbelina escapes the toad, she's immediately captured by a beetle. This represents the second tier of the trafficking network. Middlemen who purchased children from street-level kidnappers and evaluated them for different markets. The beetle is initially attracted to Thumbelina's beauty, but when his friends criticize her appearance, he decides she's worthless and abandons her. This perfectly mirrors documented practices in Victorian trafficking networks. Children were evaluated by groups of criminals who assessed their potential value based on appearance, age, and perceived attractiveness to different types of clients. Those who didn't meet certain standards were often discarded, left to survive on their own or die. The beetle's rejection of Thumbelina after group criticism reflects the cold, commercial nature of these evaluations. Thumbelina's period of survival in the wilderness represents what happened to many trafficking victims who were deemed unsuitable for immediate sale. They were forced to survive on their own, often turning to petty crime, begging, or accepting exploitative labor arrangements just to stay alive. Many died during this period, but those who survived often became more vulnerable to subsequent exploitation. This is exactly what happens to Thumbelina when she encounters the field mouse. The mouse offers shelter and food, but demands labor in return. This represents the common practice of using apparently charitable arrangements to exploit child victims. The field mouse is unevil in the traditional sense. She is providing genuine help, but she is also extracting value from Thumbelina's desperation. The mouse's insistence that Thumbelina marry the mole reveals another layer of the trafficking system. The mole represents wealthy elite predators who could afford to purchase children for long-term exploitation under the guise of legitimate relationships. The mole is described as blind, wealthy, and living underground in elaborate tunnels, a perfect metaphor for elite criminals who operated in secret, had resources to maintain victims long-term, and were willfully blind to the suffering they caused. The mole's hatred of sunlight and flowers, everything that Thumbelina loves, represents psychological destruction that elite predators inflicted on their victims. They didn't just want physical control. They wanted to eliminate everything that represented innocence, joy, and connection to the natural world. The planned marriage represents the final stage of trafficking. Permanent ownership disguised as legal relationship. Thumbelina's rescue by the flower fairy prince might seem like a genuinely happy ending. But when understood in the context of Victorian trafficking, it represents something much more sinister. The fairy prince represents the highest tier of clientele. Wealthy, powerful men who could afford to rescue girls from lower-level exploitation, but only to claim them for their own exclusive use. The transformation of Thumbelina into a fairy princess with wings doesn't represent genuine freedom. It represents elevation to a more prestigious form of exploitation. In Victorian trafficking networks, the most beautiful and compliant victims were sometimes elevated to serve exclusively wealthy clients, living in luxury but still fundamentally imprisoned. The wings that allow Thumbelina to fly represent the illusion of freedom that came with this elevated status. The evidence that Andersen was documenting real trafficking networks becomes even more compelling. When you examine the historical context of Copenhagen during the period when he wrote Thumbelina, police records from the 1830s and 1840s document extensive organized child trafficking operations centered in Copenhagen, with established routes bringing children from rural Denmark and other Scandinavian countries into the city's red light districts. These operations were sophisticated businesses with multiple tiers of personnel. Street-level kidnappers and recruiters acquired children through force, fraud, or purchase from desperate families. Middlemen evaluated, transported, and sold children to different types of clients. Lead operators maintained exclusive establishments, serving wealthy clientele who could afford long-term arrangements. The records describe children being classified by age, appearance, and perceived compliance, with different markets for different types of victims. The youngest and most attractive were reserved for elite clients, while others were used in lower-tier establishments or forced into other forms of exploitation. Children who became too old, too damaged, or too resistant were often discarded or killed. Contemporary accounts from police investigations, social reformers, and journalists describe a systematic process that matches Thumbelina's journey almost exactly. Initial kidnapping from families, evaluation and potential rejection by criminal groups, periods of desperate survival, and eventual capture by higher-level operators for long-term exploitation. What makes Andersen's possible connection to these networks even more disturbing is evidence from his personal writings. His diaries contain numerous references to guilt and shame related to unspecified activities, visits to establishments he describes in coded language, and obsessive interest in purity and innocence. That suggests possible participation in the very crimes he was documenting. Letters from contemporaries describe Andersen as having unusual relationships with young people and being involved with questionable establishments in Copenhagen's entertainment district. While this evidence isn't conclusive, it suggests that Andersen's knowledge of trafficking networks may have been more than academic. The transformation of this trafficking documentation into a beloved children's story represents one of history's most successful cultural sanitizations. Over the decades following its publication, the disturbing elements of Thumbelina were gradually softened. The coded language was forgotten, and the trafficking narrative was replaced with generic fairy tale elements. This sanitization process accelerated during the 20th century as society became more sensitive to issues of child exploitation. Publishers wanted stories that could be safely marketed to families, not tales that reminded readers of ongoing crimes against children. The fantasy elements were enhanced, the darker implications were removed, and eventually, the story became associated with positive messages about finding your place in the world and believing in yourself. Disney's 1994 animated adaptation represents the final stage of this sanitization. In Disney's version, all traces of the trafficking narrative have been eliminated. Thumbelina is portrayed as an empowered young woman making her own choices, rather than a victim being passed between predators. The kidnappings become adventures, the forced marriages become comic misunderstandings, and the exploitation becomes romance. But this sanitization comes at a cost. By transforming a documentation of child trafficking into harmless entertainment, society has lost an important historical record of one of its darkest chapters. More troubling, it has created a cultural narrative that obscures rather than illuminates the ongoing reality of child exploitation. Today, more than 1.2 million children are trafficked annually through networks that operate using methods virtually identical to those documented in Thumbelina. Children are still kidnapped or purchased from vulnerable families, still pass between different tiers of criminal organizations, still evaluated and sorted based on their perceived value to different markets, and still forced into various forms of exploitation under the guise of legitimate relationships. The same progression that Thumbelina experiences: initial kidnapping, evaluation and potential rejection, desperate survival, and eventual capture by elite predators remains the standard pattern in modern trafficking networks. The same psychological techniques used to control trafficking victims: isolation, dependency, normalization of abuse, and false choices between different forms of exploitation are still employed by criminal organizations worldwide. The geographic routes may have changed, but the essential structure remains the same. Rural and economically disadvantaged areas serve as sources for victims. Urban centers serve as evaluation and distribution points. And elite networks provide long-term exploitation opportunities for wealthy clients who can afford exclusive access. What's most disturbing is how modern society continues to romanticize and sanitize stories that document these realities. Instead of recognizing Thumbelina as a historical record of organized crime, we've transformed it into entertainment that actively obscures the very crimes it originally described. We've taught children to see trafficking patterns as magical adventures and to interpret predatory behavior as romantic interest. The real tragedy of Thumbelina isn't that a tiny girl was kidnapped and exploited. The real tragedy is that we've taken a story that could serve as education about the realities of child trafficking and turned it into propaganda that makes children more vulnerable to exactly the kind of exploitation it originally documented. When parents read Thumbelina to their children today, they're unknowingly teaching them that being kidnapped can lead to adventure, that being sold can lead to romance, and that being exploited can lead to happiness. They're preparing children to see trafficking patterns as normal, romantic, and potentially beneficial. This is why understanding the true meaning of stories like Thumbelina matters. It's not just about historical accuracy or literary analysis. It's about recognizing how cultural narratives can be used to normalize and conceal ongoing crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. The next time you encounter the story of Thumbelina, remember that you're not reading a fairy tale about a magical journey. You're reading a coded documentation of child trafficking networks that destroyed thousands of lives across Victorian Europe. And remember that those same networks, using those same methods, are still operating today, still destroying lives, still counting on society's willingness to transform their crimes into entertainment. See you next.